Number 5. Randy Greenawalt and Gary Tyson. As a 2-for-1 bonus for our viewers, our first entry on this list details the imprisonment, escape, and brutal rampage of 2 prisoners from the Florence State Prison in Arizona, USA. In 1974, Randy Greenawalt and his brother James were held on suspicion for the murder of a truck driver named Stanley Sandage. The brothers had shot the driver and taken his wallet before being arrested when they tried to purchase stereo equipment with the victim's credit card. The authorities realized that the killing was extremely similar to the death of another driver, Henry Weber, 4 days earlier. The 2 brothers were charged with the murders, but Randy was able to avoid the death penalty by testifying against his brother. He was sent to Florence State Prison where he met Gary Tyson. Tyson had attempted to escape several times and was serving a life sentence for stabbing a prison guard. The 2 men formed a plan together to try and escape with the help of Tyson's 3 sons, who showed up to visiting day with a concealed shotgun and helped the 2 prisoners to overpower the guards and escape, with plans of escaping to a ranch in Mexico. They quickly ran into trouble when their car blew a tire. A kind stranger driving with his wife, infant son, and teenage niece came across them and tried to see if they needed help. They were taken prisoner by the convicts and taken into the desert where they were shot and left for dead, while Greenawalt and the Tysons fled in the family's Mazda. They made contact with a woman Greenawalt had become pen pals with, who bought them a truck and ammunition, plans of making their way to an airplane that Gary had chartered for their escape. The police caught wind of this, and the gang was forced to try and make alternate arrangements. They made their way to Texas, where they killed a couple of newlyweds and took their car. Days later, they were met with a roadblock, which they ruthlessly barreled their way through, before being met with another one 6 miles down the road. The officers opened fire on the gang, hitting one of the Tyson sons who was driving. The remaining 2 brothers in Greenawalt were captured, but Gary Tyson got away, although he was found dead in the desert 11 days later, having died a slow death of exposure to the elements. The brothers were sentenced to life in prison, and Gary was executed by lethal injection after spending 2 decades on death row. Number 4. Lyda Southard, the Black Widow. While not all marriages end well, and some can accurately be described as unmitigated disasters, few have ended as poorly as the various marriages of Lyda Southard. But, for all her faults, no one can say she didn't take the vow of till death do us part seriously. Lyda married her first husband, Robert Dooley, in the year 1912. For a while, it seemed a good match, with Dooley's brother Edward joining them on their ranch in Twin Falls, Idaho, and the couple having a daughter named Lorraine 2 years later. When she was a year old, Lorraine suddenly died, having apparently drunk tainted water from a dirty well. Tragedy struck again later that year, when Edward died of food poisoning. 2 months after that, Robert died of typhoid fever, and Lyda was left the only surviving family member. Fortunately for her, she had taken out life insurance policies on each of her family members, and had over $4,500 to try and start over after this tragedy. She soon married William G. McCaffell, becoming the stepmother to his 3-year-old daughter. When his daughter fell ill and died, the couple decided to move to Montana together, but within a year, William died of influenza, leaving poor Lyda a widow once again. Bad luck seemed to follow her wherever she went, with her next husbands, Harlan C. Lewis and Edward F. Meyer, both dying of sudden illnesses within 4 months of marrying Lyda. A relative of her first husband started to notice the pattern and had his family's corpses exhumed and examined, proving that all had died of arsenic poisoning. The other bodies showed the same results when tested, and Lyda was arrested before she had a chance to murder her 5th husband, Paul Southard, for the insurance money. She was sentenced to 10 years to life in the old Idaho State Penitentiary, where she remained as a model prisoner for the next 10 years. The guards eventually stopped watching her as closely as they should have, and in 1931 she managed to remove a bar from her prison window and use her bed sheets to construct a rope in order to escape. She remained at large for over a year until she was found in Topeka, Kansas, married to her 6th husband, Harry Whitlock. She was taken into custody for another 10 years before being released in 1941. She died of a heart attack in 1958, whereupon her 7th husband, Hal Shaw, likely breathed an unconscious sigh of relief.
Coming in at number 3 we have Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, was born in 1960 in Texas. He was one of 5 children. When he was 5 years old, he was knocked unconscious by a swing. It was said that this caused great trauma to his brain and he began experiencing epileptic fits. years. As he was growing up, he grew close to his cousin Miguel. He had returned from fighting the war in Vietnam. He would tell Richard stories of his torture of soldiers and women while he was at war. Horrifying stories that he was proud to tell. He even had photos to show him of what he had done. At the age of 13, Richard witnessed his cousin taking the life of his wife. When he was 14, he dropped out of school. He was arrested for the first time at 17 for possession of marijuana. He then moved to California, where he started to do crimes to get by. He started to cultivate an interest in Satanism, leading him down an even darker path. His theft turned to violence in 1984 when he committed his first home invasion. In the 60s, it was more common to leave your doors unlocked as people were not as concerned about safety issues in their neighborhoods. Richard took advantage of this. He would move in the dead of night, stalking women who were home alone. At first, his attacks would be months apart, but they soon got more frequent. Although some of his victims managed to escape, he was still able to avoid detection. They could not track him down, but his satanic symbolism left at the scene was a clear indication that it was his doing. He soon coined the term Night Stalker as he snuck into people's homes during the night undetected. In his final attack, he left a footprint. His car was spotted, and his victim gave a detailed witness report. This led to his eventual capture. He was beaten by LA residents while attempting to steal a car. His face was all over the media at this point, and he had nowhere to hide. During his rampage throughout a number of years, he took the lives of around 14 and attacked dozens more. He spent the rest of his life in prison. Coming in at number 2, we have Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a cult leader in the late 1960s. His cult went on to make history after their brutal acts carried out under his command. Born Charles Maddox in 1934, his mother was only 16 and suffering from addiction problems. His mother married William Manson, giving him the famous last name, but the marriage ended quickly and Charles was sent to a boys' school. His mother rejected any attempt he made to return to her, and he was soon living on the streets doing petty crimes to get by. Over the next 20 years, he was in and out of prison. In 1967, he was released and decided to move to San Francisco. Feeling cast out from his own mother, he started his cult and referred to them as the family. He grew his cult to around 100 followers who shared his passion for an unconventional lifestyle. The Manson family eventually moved to a deserted ranch in San Fernando Valley. His following included a large number of young girls who believed he was a prophet. These girls were often used to lure victims or other members to the cult. It is thought that the cult carried out around 35 attacks before they were finally stopped. One of the most well known of their victims was actress Sharon Tate, who was pregnant at the time of her attack. It was in August 1969 he gathered together his most loyal to attack Hollywood's elite. He wanted to go for the beautiful people with fame and money. It was said that Manson felt rejected by the showbiz world when he had attempted to get his own recording contract and wanted revenge. He himself did not take part in any of the actual violence. When the family was arrested, the police had no idea that they committed these acts of violence. They were arrested for vandalizing the property they were staying on. One of the members gave a confession and they finally connected them to the crime. The members were given life in prison. At the trial, they showed no remorse in their acts and even said they wished they had done more. And finally, in at number 1, we have Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was a notorious American criminal. He was born in 1946 and started to commit his crimes during the 70s. There are many novels, films, and TV shows about his life. What was the most disturbing about Ted was his ability to live a normal life and even being well liked while he was committing these horrible acts. He lived a normal life and was seen as a successful, intelligent man. His mother Eleanor was a single mother when she gave birth to him. No one ever knew who the biological father was, although there have been some guesses over the years. When he was born, much of Eleanor's family shamed her for having an illegitimate child. He was seen as a sin and the family's dirty secret. For many years, Ted was told that his mother was his sister, and he was adopted by his grandparents. Eleanor eventually took Ted and moved to Washington. His mother married Johnny Bundy, and although Ted took his last name, he did not have respect for this new stepfather. He believed he was too uneducated and working class for his family. They went on to have more children, although it does not appear Ted was close to any of his siblings. At a young age, he became obsessed with knives. Then as a teenager, he grew the obsession of watching people through their windows and stealing things he wanted with no sign of remorse. He went on to earn a degree in psychology and was active in the community. He worked on the campaign for the Republican governor and even received an award for his work. He had his first heartbreak during the school days, and later on it was clear some of his victims resembled the girl who had left him. His crimes would often consist of luring women into his car. They would never be seen again. During the 70s, when he was working in the community and seen as a charismatic professional, this is when he was the most active with his crimes. He would travel around taking the lives of these women and then be back at work the next morning. When he was finally caught, everyone who knew him was shocked. He portrayed portrayed himself so well no one could believe he would do this. Even once he was on trial, he gained a following of women worshipping him. They didn't care about his crimes against his victims. One of the victims finally escaped in 1975, and this began the downfall. Though he somehow escaped from prison twice, he was eventually captured for the last time and sentenced to the electric chair.
Number 5. The Servant Girl Annihilator. I can't believe I just said those words. The Servant Girl Annihilator. I can't believe that's the real name newspapers went with to call this guy. I know not everyone's gonna be able to get a nickname like Jack the Ripper, but you can't go around calling criminals stuff like the Servant Girl Annihilator. You're just gonna inflate their ego. You're making him sound like he's a Dark Souls boss, or he's gonna be jumping in the ring against Hulk Hogan and the Iron Sheik. Anyway, sorry, I had to get this out of the way before we could talk about it. I feel like we just had to address this name. We couldn't just look at that and move on. And you know the wildest part? He doesn't even have the craziest name on this list. Okay, let's get into it. The Servant Girl Annihilator was the nickname of a brutal night stalker who preyed on the streets of Austin, Texas in 1885, a full 3 years before Jack the Ripper would stalk Whitechapel and steal all the fame and fortune in the attacking women at night community. Despite his name, he actually didn't exclusively target women. Unlike his British counterpart, Mr. the Ripper, the SVGA attacked men and women, although he mostly focused his attention on women, and they were all servant girls, which is where the name came from. He ended up slaying 7 women and 1 man, and critically injured 6 women and 2 men on top of that. All of his victims carried out the same way, attacking them whilst they slept in their beds, and then dragging them out into the streets when he was finished with them, usually with a sharp object such as a knife or a needle sticking out of the ear. There was a wild manhunt for the Annihilator, and it's said that in 1885 some 400 men were questioned and interrogated about the identity of the Annihilator. Elected officials apparently refused to believe that it could be the work of one lone psycho, thinking there was a group of men committing these crimes together for Lord knows why. While several men would end up being questioned, no one was ever successfully linked to these brutal crimes. He was never caught, but an increased presence by sheriff's department and citizens forming an armed militia to protect the streets were enough to scare off whoever was doing it into fleeing the area, and eventually the crime stopped. So where did he go? That's the question, because he was never found. There are some who even wonder if perhaps maybe he bought himself a train ticket and found his way to Whitechapel to continue his spree. And my friends, if you're looking for more true crime stories, more rumors, whispers, conspiracies, cryptids, aliens, video games, movies, and whatever else we got, Top 5 Scary has it all. Number 4, Bible John. Everyone on this list has a weird nickname. Everybody. I'm gonna tell you that right now. I'm just gonna spoil that for you. Coming up next on this list is going to be Bible John, who's got a name that is deceptively unassuming. Bible John was an infamous executioner who preyed on women in Glasgow in the late 60s. All of his victims he met at a popular nightclub, the Barrel and Ballroom. He operated for a few years and is confirmed to be connected to at least 3 cases and maybe more. He was subject to one of Scotland's most extensive manhunts. He was the first time a composite sketch in the country was ever used as the front page of the newspaper. All because there were so few details about the case or just who he was. What few tidbits of trivia and information we have on Bible John, his crimes, his motives, and his modus operandus come from one of the victim's sisters, who very briefly shared a taxi with Bible John and her sister on the night of her death. Her very brief witness, it was only a 20-minute trip, was all the information they had to provide investigators to form a psychological profile of him, aiding in the investigation. Now, the name Bible John would stem from his practice of obsessively quoting the Bible and ranting and raving about adultery to his victims before, well, you know. The statement we have with Gene Puttock states that in the short period of time they spent together, he was making nigh constant and frequent references to specific Bible passages and really hammering home how much he hated adulterous women. He preyed on brunette women who all looked fairly similar and found them all at the same nightclub, charming them and then attacking them. Their bodies would later be found naked in the streets with signs of strangulation. The only witness, one Gene Puttock, passed away in 2010, with no more leads and the case having been on ice for nearly 50 years. It's very unlikely Bible John will ever be found anytime soon if he's still out there.
Number 3, Nikolai Zhumagaliev, the Metal Fang. Nikolai was born in 1952 in the Soviet Union. He went to railway school before being conscripted into the Soviet army. After his service ended, he tried to go to university or become a driver, but failed at both. He worked various odd jobs, including that of a sailor, a forwarder, an electrician, a bulldozer operator, and a firefighter. He spent a lot of this time fantasizing about and planning murders, committing his first in 1979 on a woman he had encountered traveling across a rural path. He committed 5 more murders that year whose victims he then cannibalized, and may have committed more if not for the fact that one night he got extremely drunk and accidentally shot one of his co-workers. He was arrested, diagnosed with schizophrenia, and sent to a mental institution. He was released less than a year later and he resumed his murders, committing 2 more. His 9th murder is what resulted in him being captured, as he had invited guests over to his home. He brought one of the guests into a different room, killed them, and began dismembering them with an axe. The other guests walked in on this and fled the scene before calling the police. They came to get him but were so shocked at the sight of him that he managed to escape before being captured the next day. He was declared insane and incarcerated in a mental hospital where he remained for the next 8 years. In 1989, while being transferred to a different hospital, he managed to hijack the vehicle and escape. He was able to avoid capture for 2 years, killing at least one more person while at large, before he allowed himself to be caught stealing sheep. His hope was that he would not be recognized and could go to jail for a relatively minor offense. The story he gave the officers didn't add up, and a colonel familiar with the case was sent to check the situation out. He identified Nikolai, and he was sent back to a mental hospital where he remains to this day. Number 2. Ted Bundy. The most well-known of the monsters on this list, Ted Bundy was a cold-hearted murderer who would feign injury in order to get close to women and then attack them into unconsciousness in order to take them to a secondary location where he would take advantage of them before strangling them to death. He would often return to the bodies of the victims where he would subject the corpses to further indignities, for decomposition made this impossible. He later confessed to 30 murders, but the authorities believe his real body count is likely extremely larger. In one of the first examples of computers being used to investigate serial killer crimes, authorities compiled all the information they had based on witness statements to come up with likely suspects, and the computer produced a list of 26 names, one of them Bundy's. At the same time, detectives made a list manually of their 100 best suspects. When Bundy's name appeared on both lists, he became their #1 suspect, but word came out that he had already been arrested. A highway patrol officer had seen Bundy cruising a residential area and fleeing upon seeing the police car. When searched, they found a crowbar, handcuffs, a ski mask, rope, and an ice pick, among other suspicious items in Bundy's car. He was soon linked to and found guilty in a kidnapping case until the authorities gathered more evidence to charge him with the murders. In Utah State Prison, he attempted an escape and was placed in solitary confinement for several weeks before being transferred to Garfield County Jail. He was then taken to the Pitkin County Courthouse, where he chose to act as his own attorney. This allowed him to avoid having to wear handcuffs and shackles, and during a court recess he was allowed into the court library to research his case, where he snuck away from his guards and fled through the library window. He made his way to an Aspen hunting cabin, which he broke into and stole food and a rifle from. He became lost in the mountains and eventually found his way back to Aspen, where he stole a car but was soon apprehended by authorities. He was sent back to prison where he acquired a hacksaw blade and spent 6 months sawing a hole in the bars in his window. He squeezed through the gap and into the crawl space, which led to the chief jailer's apartment, where he stole clothes and walked right out the front door. During the 2 months of freedom following his second escape, Bundy managed to kill 2 sorority girls and 1 12-year-old girl before eventually being arrested for driving a stolen car near the Alabama state line and being sent back to prison where he remained until his eventual execution. Number 1. Earl Nelson. When Earl Nelson was 2 years old, his parents died and he was sent to live with his grandmother and her 2 younger children. Even from his young childhood days, he exhibited self-loathing and morbid behavior, being expelled from his primary school as a 7-year-old. He got even worse after being hit by a streetcar and being knocked out for almost a week. Upon awakening, he began to suffer from intense headaches and memory loss, and his behavior became more and more erratic. He was in and out of prison as a young adult for relatively minor charges such as trespassing and larceny. He eventually ended up in Los Angeles County Jail, where he remained for 5 months before escaping and joining the Navy. He was committed to the Napa State Mental Hospital by a Navy psychologist who described him as living in a constitutional psychotic state. The doctors at the institution described him as suffering from hallucinations and paranoid delusions, but they deemed him relatively harmless. In his time at the hospital, he managed to escape 3 times, causing the staff to nickname him Houdini and eventually stopped searching for him. He was sent back to the hospital after trying to assault a minor, but escaped 2 more times before eventually being discharged in 1925. The next year, he began his string of murders. He would travel the country pretending to be a harmless traveling Christian looking for women with rooms to rent. He would then be invited into the women's homes, whereupon he would assault and murder them by strangling them. Not always in that order. A witness who saw him near the scene of the crime described him as a dark and stocky man with long arms and large hands, causing the newspapers to begin calling Earl Nelson the Gorilla Man, or the Dark Strangler. He managed to cross the country, killing at least 16 women, as well as 2 of their children, before making his way to Canada to avoid the growing manhunt. While in the country, he killed 2 more people before authorities were able to track him down and arrest him at a nearby train station. He escaped from the prison that very same night and boarded a train going south back into the States. The train happened to be carrying several members of the local police force, who recaptured him and took him back to prison. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. Although he tried to appeal this for reasons of insanity, he was hanged in Winnipeg in early 1928 at the age of 30 years old, after killing at least 23 people and having escaped incarceration on 7 separate occasions.
Number 5. Niccolo Paganini. The first up on our list today of people who summoned the devil or a demon of some kind is Niccolo Paganini, who was once called the Devil's Violinist, which is quite the nickname. Looks great on a resume. I didn't know the devil really hired out help like that. Paganini, which does sound a bit like a delicious sandwich, was born in 1782 in Genoa, Italy. Under his father's influence, he was given lessons by renowned violinists, quickly becoming a prodigy. His musical talents were praised, and he was given all manner of scholarships. He had his first performance at 11, and by age 15, he was already touring around Italy performing, just in case you needed something to compare yourself to and feel bad about your own achievements. Don't feel bad. I'm 26, I haven't toured Italy once. He was particularly well known for being able to perform recitals without sheet music. He memorized everything and was apparently able to play 12 notes a second at an inhuman speed. Now, while this could be explained by the fact that he'd been raised to play the violin in a Spartan-like upbringing, locals around Genoa began to whisper and tell stories of how he must have sold his soul to be able to play the violin like that. It also didn't help much that Niccolo's pale, lanky, and quite ghost-like appearance made people a bit suspicious of the guy. I get it, as someone who's very tall, lanky, and ghost-like, people ask me all the time, Taylor, did you sell your soul to be so good at YouTube hosting? The answer? Yes. Paganini was a striking man with hollow cheeks, pale skin, and very long, thin fingers, which did not calm any of these rumors down. These things plagued his reputation, with people claiming outlandish things, saying they'd seen him with hooves, they'd seen him talking to the devil. Some say his violin was made out of the intestines of a woman he'd slain, and her soul was trapped in his violin, which I guess would make it sound beautiful? Now, in the end, Paganini would contract tuberculosis, and found himself getting weaker and weaker as the months and years went by. Before his death, he turned away last rites from a Catholic priest, saying he didn't need him because he wasn't going to die. He would pass shortly after. Was it because he'd already made his last rites with Satan, or was he just confident? It's up to you to decide. And if you're looking for more freaky stories of demonic possession, exorcisms, and all that jazz, we've got loads of that on the channel. If ghosts and goblins ain't your jam, we've got cryptids, conspiracies, aliens, government cover-ups, basically anything scary above or under the sun, we've covered it more than a few times. So click on through, hit that bell to not miss a single scream, but please, do that at the end of this video, okay? We got way more scary stories coming up for you. Number 4, Latoya Ammons. Our next entry on this list is Latoya Ammons and her mother, Rosa Campbell, involving an infamous haunting that is sometimes referred to as the 200 Demon House or the Demon House. That's a lot of demons. A family moved into a new house in Gary, Indiana, only to quickly discover that the house already had plenty of residents. They claimed that black flies would swarm the porch every single day in December in a climate that should reasonably have had them die off. Mother Rosa Campbell claims she heard footsteps in the basement and doors creaking, and witnessed a shadowy specter of a man pacing around her living room, claiming he was leaving behind boot prints. Now that's pretty scary. But the most wild claim was that this spirit man once choked her directly. Rosa's daughter Latoya claimed that she levitated above her daughter while unconscious during a sleepover, leading to her friend praying for her safety until she returned to the ground. Another wild incident describes an unknown force pushing the son of the family firmly into a wall, with a voice in the back of his head screaming, "It's time to die." Strangely, the family didn't decide to, burn the house down and move out and change state lines, but instead reached out to their family physician. You know the old saying, when there's something strange, who are you gonna call? your local general practitioner. Well, the doc visited the house and noted that he thought the behavior of the family was delusional. So the family went to Father Michael Maganote in 2012, who was called in to perform an exorcism. He believed the family had unintentionally summoned a demon and were being tormented by hundreds of demons. And the real estate agent didn't mention that, did he? In the end, the father exorcised the house, and the Ammons family moved to Indianapolis in peace, where they now await a movie deal from 20th Century Fox, I'm certain. Number 3, the Doodler. Next up on this list is the Doodler. Like everybody else, don't let the goofy name fool you into thinking there is anything silly or funny about this guy. Now, this bizarre nickname would come about from his habit of drawing pictures of his victims before he would attack them. And I guess the drawer or the sketcher or the artist didn't quite roll off the tongue the same way that the Doodler did, and that's the name they went with. The exact body count of the Doodler is unknown, but police believe that it could be anywhere from 6 to 14 victims total in San Francisco, stretching from 1974 to 1975. Several men disappeared from the city's gay community, and more were injured. And part of what made him so hard to identify is that despite the city's historically very liberal and accepting view of the LGBTQ+ community, at the time the larger mainstream whole community hadn't quite got there yet. And so several of the men who would end up surviving an attack were too worried about outing themselves to want to cooperate with the police, leading to very few victims cooperating with the police, meaning there was very little information for any of them to work with, and the criminal was able to successfully elude pursuit. Ironically, for someone named the Doodler, the composite face sketch they had from witnesses is the only real bit of evidence they ever had to work with. However, unlike a lot of the other cases on this list, this one is actually still actively ongoing. There's a $200,000 reward for anyone that has any additional information. And as of 2019, this case is still ongoing, with DNA and fingerprint evidence being used to try to narrow down the ever wide net of potential subjects of interest and hopefully get some closure on a horrible chapter in San Francisco's history. Number 2, the Pickler. Now, I've talked about the Pickler before on this channel, but his story is so horrifying and honestly unbelievable that it's worth repeating at least once. Again, goes without saying, like every single entry else on this list, the Pickler leads you to believe this is going to be a silly story, but wait about a minute, I'll explain why he's called the Pickler and all the pieces will come together and you'll regret clicking on this video. This one's kind of a dark one. The Pickler's real name was Bela Kiss, and he worked as a tinsmith in the early 1900s, living in a humble small village in Hungary. He had been married and he had children, but his wife had left and with her took the children. He moved in a housekeeper who served as his sole faithful companion. His housekeeper would note that he seemed to entertain a plethora of female guests and was never hurting for women's attention, although she didn't talk to any of the guests much. Outside of his women callers, Kiss was actually fairly isolated. He kept to himself mostly, he didn't interact with his neighbors much at all, or the community as a whole, instead preferring to tend to himself and living quietly alone with his housekeeper and his big collection of metal drums. He had a stockpile of metal drums all over his property, and when people would ask about them, he said that he was stockpiling gas. In 1914, Kiss would be conscripted to serve with the Hungarian army and left behind his home to his noble housekeeper. While deployed, Hungarian soldiers were running low on resources, and when they needed gas, some soldiers on patrol saw fit to take from Kiss's collection over his property. However, when they went to recover the gas, they were shocked to discover what the barrels actually contained. No gas to be found, but instead the bodies of several missing women floating in alcohol in an attempt to preserve or pickle their corpses. See what I mean? Not pleasant even remotely. There were 20 barrels in total, and inside each one was another missing woman. But perhaps most alarmingly of all of this is that they appeared to have been drained of their bodily fluids with punctures in the neck, which sounds made up. As if this guy wasn't scary enough, there's also the very real possibility that he might have been a vampire. Now, upon this discovery, the Hungarian army immediately moved to try and locate and apprehend Bela Kiss, but discovered that that would prove quite difficult, since he had both a very common Hungarian name at the time, and he was also deployed in the middle of the largest conflict the world had ever seen at the time, and was just one more face in a green uniform. Somehow, Kiss learned that he was being pursued and faked his death by leaving behind a corpse in a hospital that had his ID. Kiss fled and was never seen in Europe again. A few scattered sightings would report him throughout New York, but he was never found and eluded capture for the remainder of his days. It's unlikely he's still out there, but you never know. And finally, number 1, the Zodiac. If we're talking talking about evil people who've managed to elude capture, it might feel a little obvious to put the Zodiac as number one, you know? But he's also one of the most infamous, strangest, and scariest criminal stories in American history, so it's never a bad story. Well, it is. It's a terrible story, but it's a very interesting one to hear. The Zodiac terrorized California throughout the late 60s and early 70s, personally claiming responsibility for 37 victims. He stole headlines and media attention for years, as the state was fascinated and terrified by what he would do next, and if he would ever be caught. His exploits have been the subject of a few films and TV, most famously David Fincher's Zodiac, starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr., dramatizing the investigation trying to find him unsuccessfully. Although he himself insisted that he left a trail of 37 bodies, the police were only ever able to connect 5 different deaths to the Zodiac. People would be attacked by a lone gunman, with nothing seemingly connecting the cases. Motive, modus, everything was unclear. The case would become legendary when he sent his infamous letters to 3 separate newspapers, containing details that only the real assailant could have possibly known about the crimes, inviting and challenging police to a game to catch him. He sent out a postcard boldly displaying "My name is," and then a blank spot with an invitation to solve one of his puzzles. If you saw the new 2022 Batman movie, Paul Dano's Riddler is directly inspired off the Zodiac, all of his methodology, taunting people, leaving weird riddles at his crime scenes, that sort of stuff. His letters were threatening, taunting, and incomprehensible. The code he wrote in would stump detectives for years, to this day, with only one of his ciphers ever being solved, and it not being nearly enough to connect any dots. The riddle that was solved spelled out a confession of sorts, but it mostly served as the Zodiac gloating about the nature of his crimes and saying that he did it solely because he thought it was fun, and that it was the most thrilling, fun thing a man could do. Described it as being better than hunting games or getting your rocks off. He didn't mention whether or not it was better than writing riddles and codes though. Now at the time, obviously they looked into just about everyone they could, and there were several prominent suspects and people of interest, but nothing concrete and final. The rest of his riddles were never solved, and as far as we know, he was never caught. However, in 2018, a private team of investigators was absolutely determined to close the case once and for all, and put an end to one of California's most infamous mysteries. They had identified an 80-year-old Gary Francis Post, who had passed away. He resembled the composite sketches of the Zodiac, and forensic evidence had actually made some compelling arguments that could tie it to being him, but the FBI have denied this claim, and say that they still consider the case open. Will it ever be closed within our lifetime? We may never know, but the one thing that's certain is that we are not going to stop trying until we get some answers. You want my theory? Personally, I think Jack the Ripper is the Zodiac. I think that would be the ultimate plot twist to the end of all of this. Number 5. Frank Matthews. Our first spot is notorious criminal kingpin Frank Matthews, a legendary crime lord operating out of New York in the 1960s, who also had some pretty cool classic mafia names like Pee-wee and Black Caesar. Built himself a criminal empire that Los Polos Hermanos would have been jealous of. Starting out small, working in racketeering and illegal gambling ops in Philly in the 1960s, he had his sights set on much bigger things, working his way up, collecting numbers, making contacts, until he could start selling product for some serious money. By the early 1970s, he was already trading millions of dollars for illegal narcotics, importing his stuff from Latin America and distributing it throughout the states. Pee-wee had his hands and pockets across the country, with his criminal web spanning across 21 states at its peak. Naturally, if you're moving that much stuff around the country, with that many people involved in your operation, eventually somebody's gonna get wise. And that's exactly what happened. Boys in Blue tapped Frankie's phone communications and put out a federal bulletin for his arrest. By December 1972, Frank and his girlfriend were arrested at McCarran International in Vegas. Okay, so he got caught. This kind of breaks the list a little bit, but hear me out a little bit here. Because after spending a paltry couple months in jail, Frankie made bail and quickly got out of Dodge to literally never be seen again. Now, there is some discrepancy as to what happened. The FBI suspects that he was taken care of by a major New York crime family for fears he may turn witness. But they did also post a bounty, a $200,000 bounty for finding him, so they suspected he might still be out there. No trace of him was ever found, no body ever discovered, and his story went cold. Is he sleeping with the fishes, or did he return to pull strings from the shadows? Or maybe he pulled a Saul Goodman and started managing a Cinnabon in Omaha, living life on the lam. Man, that's 2 Breaking Bad references in one point. I gotta spread them out a little bit more. We got lots more than awkwardly wedging in Breaking Bad references on Top 5 Scary. We've got the best horror content on the web at least twice a day, every day, so hit subscribe and stay spooked. Number 4, The Pickler. You know, at first glance, this is not a particularly threatening nickname. It Kinda sounds like the absolute lamest Z-tier excuse for a Batman villain that you'd throw in as a warm-up before, you know, fighting the actual cool villain of that issue. Well, names can often be so deceiving because there really is not a lot that's funny about the Pickler once you understand why they called him that. He's maybe one of the most bizarre and macabre criminals I've ever read about. The Hungarian Bela Kiss lived in a small village near Budapest in the early 20th century. He lived with an elderly maid, but otherwise kept to himself, didn't have a tight circle of friends, but he did enjoy frequent female company. I mean, of course, with a name like Bela Kiss, makes sense. I gotta stop trying to make this guy sound cute because I'm gonna regret it in like 1 second. In 1914, during the height of the First World War, Bela left to fight with his country. Now, wartime sometimes necessitates borrowing resources wherever you can, and the Hungarian army was short on gas. On Bela's isolated property were dozens upon dozens of oil barrels all conspicuously laid out in his yard. Someone alerted the soldiers and they went to go borrow a cup or two, and were shocked to discover that upon cracking open the barrels were the bodies of several women floating in alcohol in a depraved attempt to preserve the corpses. Hence where the foul nickname the Pickler came from. See, it's not nearly as funny once you know why they call him that. 20 barrels, 20 missing women. That's somehow not even the scariest, craziest part of this whole story. The women had punctures in their necks and were drained of blood, which sounds completely made up that this guy might also have been a vampire. Now, the Hungarian army moved to seize Bela immediately, but tracking him proved rather difficult, as he had a fairly common name and was also, you know, he was in a war. Somehow, Bela was alerted that police had discovered his operation, and he left a corpse posing as himself in a military hospital and fled, never to be found again. Reported sightings popped up for a few years here and there. Allegedly, he moved to New York to begin a new life, but Bela eluded capture for the rest of his life. Unless he really was a vampire and is still out there, but I don't even want to entertain that possibility. Number 3, Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson could play the blues real well. In fact, he played it so darn well that people suspected he wasn't just really in tune with the music, but had made a deal with the devil to pluck the strings. Johnson was born in Mississippi in May 1911 and lived alongside his 9 siblings. Good gosh, imagine the rush for the bathroom in the mornings. He eventually made his way to Memphis, where he discovered his love for the blues, and boy howdy could he play them. By all accounts, he was a legendary harmonica player, but initially his friends would describe him as a pretty lousy guitarist. Well, practice makes perfect, right? Well, practice and demonic transaction. Because the story goes that Johnson would disappear for a few weeks entirely and buried his guitar at the crossroads of the now famous Highways 49 and 61 in Clarksdale, Mississippi, where the devil retuned his instrument and blessed his hands with the unnatural skills that made him a legend. When he started playing again, he was an overnight master of the blues. Now, unfortunately, the blues is born out of tragedy, and Robert Johnson was sadly no different. He passed away at the fairly early age of 27, the infamous age in which rock stars and famous musicians are purported to die with an alarming regularity. Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, to rattle off a few. What makes this particular death odd, though, is how few details exist. His death was never reported, no autopsy ever performed, no cause ever given. The only thing we have to go on is local folklore. One in particular tells the story of Johnson playing at a country dance, where Johnson had been flirting with a married woman, and she gave Johnson a bottle of whiskey, which was slapped out of his hands by Sonny Boy Williamson, another musician at the exact same show. And he told him not to drink anything that he hadn't personally seen the lid come off of, which is fairly good advice. And Johnson responded by saying, "Don't ever knock a drink out of my hand." Johnson would die in a convulsive state 3 days later, with some believing that he'd been poisoned by the woman and her husband as revenge. Or perhaps it was just the devil coming back for the merchandise that he'd paid for, his soul. Number 2, Agrippa. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa was a scholar living in the 15th century with one of the coolest names ever. Corny Agrippa. Agrippa devoted his life to writing about the occult. Now, I can freely talk to you about the occult, the devil, and all manner of blasphemous heretical things, but things haven't always been so liberal. And way back when, even so much of breathing about the devil was tantamount to sinning, so Agrippa was not a man without controversy. He wrote of the devil in great, intricate detail. His books would include information breaking down exactly how witches cast spells and perform incantations and rituals, and even shared where they get all of their cool outfits, big hats, and big stomping boots. It's mostly Hot Topic and doll skill. So where did Agrippa get all of this information? Was he just making it up? Was he really in tune with the local scene? Kind of. He claimed that when he was a young man, he gave in to the temptation of Satan and ran with a convent of witches going around engaging in rituals and casting spells, and I gotta be honest, that sounds awesome. I did a similar thing when I followed Grimes on tour. Eventually, Agrippa is said to have cleaned up a little, got over his goth phase, and said to have found Jesus and saved his soul, and began to write books preaching the good word about how you should let Jesus in your life and push the devil on out of here. Surprisingly, Agrippa was never executed despite his open nature regarding his witchcraft and occult days. It's a common misconception that he was executed for his heresy, but actually in the end, Agrippa pushed people for being more understanding of demons and the devil, and pushed for people to know their enemy. He wanted to save people from the devil's grasp and save them through prayer rather than just burning them all at the stake, which is a noble goal. And number 1, Anna Eklund. Perhaps you've heard the story of Anna Eklund before. We've covered it on the channel, I think, and it was made into a popular movie, appropriately enough titled The Exorcism of Anna Eklund, so you don't confuse it with any other exorcism movies out there. Now, Anna's story is infamous. She's a young woman from America who has the dubious award of having the world's longest exorcism, spanning decades of exercising. Those demons were in there good. Those are demons with like rent control. You're not getting them out of that apartment. It will begin in 1912 when Eklund underwent an exorcism by Father Theophilus Reisinger, a Bavarian priest. It seemed like things were successful and Anna was freed, but then in 1928, Anna began exhibiting all the telltale signs of demonic possession yet again, and Reisinger returned to perform a second exorcism on Eklund. Eklund was taken into a convent on August 1928 to be dealt with round the clock. She would behave oddly, to say the least, hissing at them like a cat, flying into fits of violent rage when offered food that had been doused in holy water. This exorcism was brutal even by exorcism standards, with Eklund allegedly levitating, howling, hanging out the door frame. Eklund was believed to be possessed by not just any old rank-and-file demon, but allegedly was possessed by Judas Iscariot, big celebrity demon inside, alongside the ghost of her own father. Who had an affair with her aunt and had made unwanted advances to Anna in life. After months of exercising, and not the good kind, Anna's body deteriorated. She would vomit up debris, her head and face swelled, she refused to consume food or drink. Eventually, after months and years of exorcism, on December 23rd, the final day of the exorcism, the battle was won and Anna was freed, and by all accounts went on to live a fairly normal life afterwards. A Christmas miracle if there ever was one.
Coming in at number 5, Thomas Midgley Jr. This man is somewhat to blame for the absolute ludicrous gas prices right now. You'd be absolutely amazed what 50 bucks can get you, all about 9 feet. But this man isn't in charge of inflation, no. This man is the man who invented leaded gasoline. Invented in the early 1920s, chemist Thomas Midgley Jr. was working on some pretty cutting-edge chemistry. His task was to conjure a way to enhance automotive gasoline to reduce or eliminate the problem of engine knocking. TEL, or better known as tetrathiolide, was an additive mixed with gasoline to do exactly that. And on December 9th, Tommy here unwillingly and unknowingly created what is to be the most destructive, biodangerous chemical compound, slowly and efficiently destroying our atmosphere. Long story short, this guy created the world's worst pollutant known to us so far, lead. Lead is a naturally occurring metal found in Earth's crust. Its widespread use has resulted in aggressive human environmental contamination. Companies GM and Standard Oil formed the Ethel Corporation shortly hereafter to produce TEL. The company's name was carefully chosen to avoid the use of the word lead. Yeah, don't just take it right out. right out. Of course, shortly after its production, workers began suffering what would become lead poisoning, which resulting, not long after it opened, workers at the Ethel plant began suffering from poisoning, which in 1922, the US Public Health Service warned of the dangers of lead production and leaded fuel. However, the phase out of leaded gasoline wasn't officially banned until about 1996, and even in some places the early 2000s. It is estimated that 7 million tons of lead were released into the atmosphere from gasoline in the United States alone, and due to its popularity and production rate since the 1920s, it has been estimated by scientists that its result on the Earth accounted for about 900,000 deaths and about 22 million years of healthy life lost. I am not making a bold statement here and saying that this man shouldn't have been born. Maybe he could have been like a pilot or something, or a dentist. I don't know. Number 4, Gottlieb Kirchhoff. If you're anything like me and are addicted to the sweeter side of life, well then this one's for you. Seems like our boys here have something in common, but trying to find a solution actually led to creating something way worse. Gottlieb Kirchhoff was a German-Russian chemist who, through the use of his pharmacy, accidentally invented one of the world's worst things for you. The bittersweet part is that it's sugar. Well, high fructose sugar actually. Basically the thing that makes everything taste good. From sody pop to candy. Fructose, or high fructose corn syrup, is made by diluting cornstarch with hydrochloric acid? Excuse me, can I have the hydrochloric acid on the side? I actually just got a root canal. Yeah, thank you. But the bittersweet part comes from the effects. See, this guy had no idea the impact of his tasty formula would have on the body. Basically, this stuff is in everything we eat and drink. To give you some numbers, kills about 1 million people a year. And I'm lowballing. Messes up our body, regulates our energy levels, and is responsible for the diabetes crisis and one of the leading causes of death from disease for humans. That's not so sweet. Next time you eat or drink anything, just look at the label. See what's in it. This guy thought he was doing us all a favor, making things tastier, making things deadlier, dude. I tried to mix this list up a bit instead of repeating main players we know who have created or been responsible for all the atrocities, and I chose Kirchhoff to be on this list for the impact that he would have on the future. I'm looking at the long game here. And if this guy wasn't born, then we probably could have avoided this breakthrough chemical discovery. And unless I'm Kyle Reese from the Terminator, we'll never know.
Number 3, D.B. Cooper. Now our next entry, I would hesitate to call him as evil as the rest of some of these crooks, you know? Sure, he hijacked a plane, sure he held the entire plane hostage, and sure he stole $200,000 from the government, but that doesn't mean he's a bad guy. D.B. Cooper's case is one of contemporary crime legends, as all that I just described sounds like he would be FBI public enemy number 1, right? Like they'd be working around the clock to bust this guy, they'd have him within the week. He slipped through authorities' fingers, and to date, D.B. Cooper was never caught. We don't know if that was even his real name or just an epithet he was using for the plane. We don't know anything really too concrete about him. Depending on what your definition of success is, D.B. Cooper could possibly be considered one of the most successful criminals of all time. To get into the nitty-gritty of the details, on November 24th, 1971, a man using the possible alias Dan Cooper boarded a flight to Seattle, and almost as soon as it took off, he passed a note to a flight attendant indicating that he had a with him, and that he demanded that when the plane landed, he trade the passengers on the flight for $200,000 and 2 parachutes. That's a smart man. He didn't want to waste any of that money on parachutes. The note said that if anything funny happened, he would blow the plane up. They complied out of fear, and upon landing, he was given the money by local authorities. Cooper then seized the plane one more time, holding the flight crew hostage with plans to fly to Mexico City. But midway through the flight, Cooper pulled a little point break and jumped out of the plane with all the money with him. And that would be the last time anyone would have ever seen D.B. Cooper. The FBI chased him for years to no avail. Nothing was ever found. No body ever recovered. No suspect ever caught out of a laundry list of people of interest. Some of the bills were recovered, but that's the only piece of evidence. Now my absolute favorite theory about D.B. Cooper, and it's kinda out there, is that he's legendary cinema director Tommy Wiseau, and that this is where his fortune came from, as the man is shrouded in mystery regarding where his seemingly limitless supply of money comes from and his mysterious origins. Is it completely ridiculous and has no basis in reality? Yes, but it's also hilarious. Now as for any more likely suspects for Cooper, there were a couple of Special Forces veterans who lined up with physical descriptions who could have been capable of committing the heist, but no concrete charges were ever made, and to date, no trace was ever found. Number 2, the Zodiac. Possibly one of the most infamous cases in American history, the Zodiac was a notorious criminal, famed in equal measures for his slayings and for his chilling obsession and interaction with the police trying to track him. He was made a household name after a Hollywood flick starring Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr. depicting the efforts trying to find him. The Zodiac is known to be responsible for 5 different deaths terrorizing California in the late 60s and early 70s, although he himself claims responsibility for 37 victims. The Zodiac case became legend when he sent his now infamous letters to 3 separate newspapers, providing details only he could have known about the crimes, and challenging the police to a sick game of sorts, sending them incomprehensible ciphers and riddles that supposedly contain clues to his identity and the crimes within. Only one of his ciphers was ever solved, and the rest remain a mystery. The Riddler from the new Batman movie is a direct inspiration from the Zodiac's sinister dealings. For 5 years, the Zodiac would taunt his pursuers with riddles and codes, sending horrifying cards, taunts, a letter boldly displaying "My name is blank," and then a cipher below it teasing their inability to find him. A postcard with his symbol written in blood, amongst others. Part of what makes the Zodiac such a fascinating and truly horrifying case is how much he seems like a movie bad guy come to life. The planning makes him out to be some sort of sinister criminal mastermind, and it's hard to disagree with that proclamation when he's completely eluded any form of capture for the better part of 50 years. There were several possible suspects as to who the Zodiac could have been, but nothing conclusive. To date, people are still trying to find the answer, hoping something new might come up to put that nightmare to rest. Number 1. Jack the Ripper. If you want to talk about evil that's got some staying power, it's hard to top Whitechapel's most infamous resident ever. 134 years avoiding capture, which means he could still be out there. The 18th century Night Stalker has held an almost supernatural-like grip over public interest since we first ever heard about the case, surrounding the brutal 5 slayings we know about, who knows how many more. Preying on women and using the cover of the night, Jack eluded, stupefied, and taunted the streets of London, leaving a disgusting trail of blood and gore in his wake, leaving victims looking like the aftermath of a butcher's. He seemed to take a sickening glee in his violent delights, mocking his would-be pursuers, sending the police threatening letters, and even organs from his crimes. Jack is an almost modern mythical boogeyman, appearing across hundreds upon hundreds of works of fiction, TV shows, movies, video games, you name it. Assassin's Creed even tried to say he was part of the Order. That's a little out there. There are some folk who offer that Jack the Ripper is the progenitor to all true crime fascination, which honestly kind of makes sense. As much as he terrified Londoners at the time, the media was obsessed with him, with the original media buzz surrounding him, paralleling how we talk about most brutal crimes these days. You can bet your bottom pounds that if Jack was terrorizing London today, there'd be podcasters talking about him in between sponsored ads for MeUndies. Jack's crimes shocked Londoners, as the vicious and public nature of the slayings were not exactly commonplace. So surely, in 130 years, someone had to have some idea as to who Mr. the Ripper was, right? Well, with a case as famous as this, obviously there are some options. A quick glance at Jack's Wikipedia page suggests a possible 31 different suspects over the years who've all been attributed to it, and those are just the ones who made the page. It's worth noting that we are still looking, we are still trying to find him, put this case to rest, because everyone wants to be the one to say they unmasked the Ripper.
Coming in at number 5, we have Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper is one of the most famous unsolved cases of all time. As mentioned in part 1, some speculated that he might have been H.H. Holmes, but we might never know who it really was. Jack is known for committing 5 gruesome murders in 1888 in London. Each attack took place within 5 miles of each other. They only attacked women of the night. The name, Jack the Ripper, comes from a letter written by someone who claimed to be the assailant. These letters were published to the public. Several letters were sent to the London Met Police Service. They would taunt the officers with clues of what was going to happen next. In the late 1800s, London's East End was viewed with contempt. It was filled with skilled immigrants who came to start a new life and run businesses. The area was known for violence and crime. Being a courtesan was legal if it didn't cause a public disturbance. Thousands of brothels provided these services during the 19th century. At the time, the death of a working girl was rarely reported on or looked into. They were often attacked. Some were attacked for refusing to pay protection money to local gangs. However, these crimes stood out from the usual random violence against these women. The sadistic nature suggested a sociopath was living in the area. His crimes seemed to portray a hatred of the entire female gender. When the murders suddenly stopped, Londoners wanted answers that would never come. Even more than a century later, people are intrigued to know who this person was. There have a number of people claim to have found the identity of the Ripper, but nothing has been confirmed by Scotland Yard. In 2014, an author claimed that using DNA evidence obtained from a shawl of one of the victims that Jack's real name was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who was one of the suspects at the time. Without confirmation from the police, we can't know which of the accused could be the real Ripper. This could forever be the most mysterious unsolved case. Coming in at number 4, we have Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was also known as Dr. Death. He was born a middle child in a working class household in Leeds, England. He was the favourite child of his domineering mother. From an early age, she instilled in him a sense of superiority that tainted the majority of his relationships later in his life. His mother was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer while he was young. He willingly oversaw her care as she declined in health. He became fascinated with the positive effect that morphine had on her suffering. She passed away from her disease in 1963. After this, he was determined to go to medical school. He was admitted to Leeds University Medical School for training. He was a loner during his life with few friends due to his arrogant attitude. He met his wife when he was 19. They married when she turned 17. 3 months later, she gave birth to their first child. By 1974, Harold had 2 children and had joined a medical practice. He initially thrived as a family practitioner before becoming addicted to painkillers. He forged prescriptions to fuel his addiction. He was forced to leave when he was caught by his colleagues. He entered a rehab program and had to pay a small fine. A few years later, he was accepted to a new medical center where he served as a general practitioner. The local undertaker began to notice that his patients seemed to be passing at an unusually high rate, usually fully clothed and sitting up in a chair. He approached Harold to ask him what the cause of this was, but he just told them it was nothing to worry about. Later, a colleague discovered the same thing, and this time she alerted the local police. They looked into it but did not fully investigate, and they found no wrongdoing on his part. He continued, and so did the amount of people passing away from his care. He was eventually found out by one determined daughter of one of his patients. Her mother had passed away after a visit to the doctor, and she refused to accept the explanations given. They uncovered a forged will by Dr. Shipman in an attempt to take the woman's fortune after she had passed due to his actions. After a long investigation, it is believed he had taken the lives of over 200 patients, but there is no clear timeline to when this started in his career. He would administer a large amount of painkillers, so he knew they would pass away within 3 hours of leaving his office. Harold was sentenced to 15 life sentences. He passed away in prison in 2004 at his own hands.
Number 3. Alfred Nobel. We're sort of seeing a pattern here. These people had somewhat of a good intention that later turned out to be not so good, which led us to even asking, were they even supposed to be born at all? Cruel, but food for thought. Alfred Nobel was a Swedish chemist, engineer, inventor, and philanthropist, and known for having sacrificed his entire fortune to establish the Nobel Prize, holding 355 patents of his own in his own lifetime. Smarty pants. Nobel's most famous invention? Dynamite. A safer and easier way of harnessing the explosive power of nitroglycerin. That sentence in itself is hilarious. And in 1867, it would soon be used worldwide for mining and infrastructure development, and oh yeah, pretty much blowing anything and everything up ever since. And of course, let's not forget the impact of dynamite's effect on a person, place, or thing in its vicinity. We've all seen the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote cartoons. And this guy invented it. Dynamite. The stick, wick, and patented chemical compound was harnessed to do exactly that. And if we've read anything at all, it did a lot of bad. First off, how do you exactly tinker and tailor with an explosion? What happens when you can't crack the code? He's just in his basement like messing around with vials. Just a little bit more of that, little bit of this, and get down! The fact that this man did not blow himself up in any of these experiments is beyond me, and not only was this invention a new form of mass energy, in fact the Nobel Prize was created and named after him. He was the first. This invention and contribution was so ahead of its time in chemistry that it revolutionized the need to push evolution ahead through science. Its creation in itself is history for mankind. The dichotomy alone. Had this man known about all the cliche train track damsel in distress westerns that would have been parodied of this destructive invention, I don't know if he would have invented it in the first place. What do you think? Number 2, the Angel of Death. Okay. This guy definitely had it coming for sure with this list. The Angel of Death was a nickname given to this person for the disturbing amount of research he had collected via his specific scientific experiments. Why I think he shouldn't have been born at all is because to attain such groundbreaking information about the human body and its extremes, experiments needed to be run and not hypothesized. Joseph Mengele was a SS officer, doctor, and German scientist during World War II, and resulted in the leading of research closely related to the extremes and limitations of the capability of the human body, via DNA, via manipulation, and disease prevention, immunization, you name it. Any effect on the human body and its environment around them. I'm not going to get into what this person concocted up in his time as a medical captain, nor am I really going to make any jokes. This person pushed scientific research through the use of cruelty and pure evilness. Plain and simple. I don't like glorifying these people in these lists, and I can barely stand saying some of their names out loud. We know all of these people. Though the actual number of people's lives countlessly lost due to this man's sick fascination with pushing research and his scientific envelope hasn't been officially documented, these experiments were responsible for the deaths of somewhat of 6 million innocent lives. It is very clear that this person's intent was to derive violence, fear, and cruelty from day one, which I myself wish this person was never born. Crimes against humanity. No good. And number 1, nuclear fission. J. Robert Oppenheimer was an American theoretical physicist and was director of the Los Alamos Laboratory during the Manhattan Project, responsible for the research and creation of the very first atomic bomb. He is often known as the father of the atomic bomb, and his research in 1945 with nuclear fission, the result of smashing atoms into each other with the mass energy containment resulting in a massive explosion. A massive explosion, and that is an understatement. Just Google mushroom cloud. Scientists first developed nuclear technology during World War II. Thankfully, atomic bombs have been used only twice in war, both times by the United States, at the end of World War II in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Fat Man and Little Boy were the official names given to the two explosive devices. Charming. What makes this so terrifying is that due to this research, the act of war and the structure of battles are now a thing of prehistoric past. The mass execution that these inventions can do is nuclear. Literally. I put Oppenheimer at the top of this list because the devastation alone due to the future with merely the technology surfacing is detrimental in itself. This is actually the first time reports that a visitor from another galaxy started. These explosions were so giant that its effect could be felt off planet. Yo, that's next level. Aliens just pulling up. Yeah, that's not really good, you know. If there was a time in the future which we could send back AI, it would probably be due to this stuff. Oppenheimer was awarded the Medal of Merit from President Harry Truman in 1946 for the push in science, even if its push was in the wrong direction. All these people given awards, it's like, hey, good job. It's terrible stuff, but cheers.
Coming in at number 5, we have Bella Gunness. Bella Gunness got away with all of her crimes in her pursuit of wealth. All of those around her perished. It is believed that she had around 40 victims between 1884 and 1908 before she disappeared without a trace. Bella was born in Norway and immigrated to the US in 1881. Her birth name was Brynhild but went by Bella. She was born in 1859. She decided to move to the US in search of money. One of her favorite ways to do this was through insurance claims. She met her first husband in 1884. He was a wealthy man who owned his own business. Not long after they were married, their home and store burned to the ground. They claimed the insurance for both buildings. Not long after this, her husband passed away due to heart failure. This was the first time it seemed suspicious, as he passed on the day his old and new life insurance policies overlapped. She claimed on both policies. Even with all of this insurance money, Bella was not done and more unexplained deaths followed her sociopath. She married her second husband, Peter Gunness. Not long after this, Peter's daughter and he himself passed away, along with her adopted daughter a few years later. It was at this point that Bella had bought herself a farm with a large amount of land where she spent the majority of her time. She began to use lovelorn columns to look for potential suitors. They would go to her farm, bringing with them large amounts of cash, but once they arrived, they were never found again. After years of this happening, Bella fled. An investigation found 40 victims on her property. She was never interrogated, so we will never know if there were other crimes that she committed. She was one of the most dangerous black widows of all time, leaving no man alive in her pursuit of wealth. Coming in at number 4, we have H.H. Holmes. H.H. Holmes was America's first ever serial killer. He was born in 1861 and the majority of his crimes took place during 1893. Some conspiracy theories even claim he was Jack the Ripper, but this is just a theory. Holmes was born in New Hampshire to an affluent family. He grew up privileged and was said to be unusually intelligent from a young age. He showed interest in the medical field and started to perform surgery on animals. There were even claims he could have been responsible for the death of his childhood friend. His life of crime first began while he was studying medicine at the University of Michigan. He was found stealing corpses and using them to make false insurance claims and then experimenting on them. In 1885 he moved to Illinois, where he ran a pharmacy after the owner mysteriously vanished. With his respect in the community and family wealth, he began to construct a hotel nearby. The house was a maze of hidden passageways, trapdoors, and rooms soundproofed behind thick walls. His quarters were on the top floor, while guests would stay on the middle and ground. Although it seemed like a high-end hotel, many visitors did not ever check out. He had hidden rooms where he would trap and torture guests. He would leave them for days without food or water before dumping them down a chute to the basement where he'd set up his lab for his experiments. It was said not only did he lure guests to the hotel, but also those looking for employment. He would hope that if travelers went missing, no one would have known their last location or come looking. Before social media, it was not as easy to know where someone was staying while they traveled. He also had a habit of getting engaged just to have his fiancée disappear before they could get married. It is estimated that before his eventual arrest, he had taken the lives of 20 to 200 people throughout his life. This shocked the world. Nothing like this had ever happened before. People became a lot less trusting. Coming in at number 3, we have John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer who took the lives of at least 33 young male victims. He was born in 1942 in Chicago. John and his siblings grew up with an alcoholic father who would show anger to his children. He would also be this way with their mother. John's sister later said they learned to toughen up and not cry. He felt alienated at school and he was unable to play with other children due to his congenital heart condition. His dad saw his condition as failing on John's part. As he grew up, he struggled with his sexuality. His father would have never accepted his son was attracted to men, and this caused him great turmoil. John worked as a fast food chain manager during the 1960s. He was a well-liked member of his community. He was married and divorced twice with 2 2 biological children. John was also a member of the Chicago area Jolly Joker Clown Club. He would dress up as his alter ego, Pogo the Clown, and perform at kids' parties or charity events. The public gave him the name the Killer Clown. He would lure his victims with the promise of work at the construction company he owned. He would then capture and do unspeakable things. In 1968, John was given a 10-year sentence for assaulting 2 young boys, but was released 2 years later on parole. In the following years, he was accused by others, but the charges often got dropped. He later referred to this as his cruising years, when he committed the majority of his crimes. He was finally caught in 1978. He was finally caught when his latest victim's mother was looking for her son. The police looked into John and found a trench system under his house filled with bodies. Once caught, he was sentenced to 12 death sentences and 21 natural life sentences. When asked why he performed as the clown, he said, "A clown can get away with murder." Coming in at number 2, we have Chris Watts. Chris Watts was the subject of the Netflix documentary American Murder: The Family Next Door. The documentary followed the tragic events of Chris taking the lives of his family to pursue a relationship with his mistress. In 2021, Watts was at the time married to 34-year-old Shanann. They were married for 6 years and had 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. They also had a son on the way who they were planning to name Nico. The couple had moved to Colorado for Chris's new job. It was also reported that the couple had filed for bankruptcy in 2015 and was struggling financially. One day when Chris returned from a business trip early in the morning, he and his wife got into an argument. He confessed to having an affair and said he wanted a divorce. Chris said that she had threatened that he would never see his daughters or their son again. Chris then took the life of his wife. He drove her out to his work site and buried her in a grave. His crimes then went further and more horrific. I recommend you go watch the documentary to see why he was such a monster. When his wife missed multiple appointments the following day, her friend called the police along with Chris to find out what happened to her. He tried to run away with his mistress, but after hearing what he had done, she refused. He showed little to no remorse for his actions when speaking to her. He then admitted to his crimes. He was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no parole. He is currently serving his time in Wisconsin. And finally, in at number 1, we have Zodiac Killer. The self-proclaimed Zodiac Killer took credit for several murders in San Francisco. During 1969 to 1974, the Zodiac Killer rampaged the San Francisco area. He taunted the police and made threats through letters sent to area newspapers. Despite intensive investigation, no one was ever arrested for the crimes. The letters started on August 1st, 1969 in San Francisco Examiner, San Francisco Chronicle and the Halo Times Herald each received individual handwritten letters in envelopes. The letters read, "Dear Editor, I'm the killer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman." The letters contained details that the public did not know. It went on to threaten further attacks if the letters were not printed on the front page of the papers. Each letter included a symbol which went on to be the zodiac symbol. Each letter came with one of a 3-part cipher that he claimed contained his identity. It was clear he had thought about these letters and had put great detail into them. These letters continued to arrive as the crimes commenced. He took great joy in taunting the police publicly and having the public being so aware of his actions. After a few days, a public school teacher and his wife were able to solve the first cipher with it reading, "I like killing people because it's so much fun." During the investigation, the public were very involved with the theories, solving the clues in the papers. In 1969, a witness was able to give the police a description of someone leaving one of the crime scenes. From this, a sketch was drawn up and was seen all over the media. Still, with the mounting evidence and now a description, he still evaded the police successfully. In 1974, the letter stopped, but the investigation continued. Some still trying to solve the mystery to this day. In October of this year, a team of 40 former law enforcement investigators who call themselves the Case Breakers claimed to have identified the Zodiac Killer. However, the FBI stated that the case is still open.